Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This is not an essay about technical architecture. It's about the disappearance of boundaries we didn't know we depended on, and how, somewhere in that process, we stop noticing what part of us has been displaced. The ideas here walk between William James, Susan Sontag, Heidegger, Foucault, but they wear none of them as armour. The tone remains plain. The concepts are not argued so much as held, like a hesitation that hasn't yet resolved into language. This is not a warning, though it contains one. It's not a vision, though it leans forward. It's an attempt to stay close to the thing that's happening while it's still happening, to witness the cognitive rearrangement before we adapt too fully to it. There's no certainty here, only proximity. Only the hope that by tracing the outline of what's changing, we might preserve some space for reflection that hasn't yet been optimized away. There is a pattern to how people speak when they believe they're falling behind. It's not urgency, it's apology. The phrases repeat with almost no variation. I'm too late, I missed the window, I don't know where to start. But no one really means that. They mean, I don't want to be caught not understanding the thing that changes everything. AI does not arrive like a headline. It arrives like a software update that rewrites the frame your thoughts live in. You don't notice the moment it happens. You notice that every conversation you have feels like it's missing something. Some invisible layer just beneath the surface. Something you're supposed to know how to interact with, even if no one taught you the terms. This is not a technical crisis. It's an epistemic one. What we used to call understanding has been replaced by interaction. Meaning is now something that gets retrieved, formatted and previewed, then passed off as insight. The very shape of knowledge is beginning to behave differently. Some people recognize the shift and reorient quickly. Others feel it like a kind of background nausea, an unease that even their questions no longer sound like the right ones. This isn't about being pro or anti-AI. It's about the subtle recalibration of intuition when the systems around you stop waiting for permission to reason. The metaphor they use is helpful, but incomplete. This is not an iPhone moment. It's not about sleekness or centrality. It's about the loss of conceptual independence. What the iPhone did to attention, this new platform shift, is doing to cognition. But the difference is, this time you can't put it down. There's a word that hasn't yet found its place in the discourse, but it's present in the silences. Surrender. Not in the dramatic sense, not in the war for the future kind of way, just the quiet kind. The kind that happens when the map keeps updating faster than you can read it. No one wants to admit it, but something about intelligence is being redefined, not just by what models can do, but by what they make us forget we used to be able to hold on our own. You weren't late. The window didn't close, it just widened past recognition. The term platform shift sounds clean, technically precise, but what it really marks is a threshold where a tool stops waiting for instructions and begins assuming your intent. This summer isn't just about new releases, it's about cognitive displacement, about which mental models quietly become obsolete without anyone naming the loss. To understand how we got here, you have to go back, not far, just far enough to remember that machine learning used to be about rules. Spam filters weren't smart, they were counting exclamation marks and searching for the word Viagra. Intelligence was measured by what could be anticipated, not what could be inferred. You told the system what to look for, and that was the point. You were the one doing the telling. Then came the shift. Neural nets started detecting patterns they weren't explicitly told to look for. Edges, textures, word relationships, king minus man plus woman equals queen. It sounded like a party trick, but it was something else. Meaning wasn't being programmed anymore. It was surfacing. In 2017, attention mechanisms cracked the architecture open. Transformers could suddenly hold relationships between tokens across long distances, long enough to remember the beginning of a sentence by the time it ended, long enough to mirror the way humans hold relevance, even through digression, long enough to model attention itself. That was the hinge. Everything that followed from GPT-2 to GPT-4 was scaling. More data, bigger models, faster training, longer context windows. The breakthroughs weren't always visible in capabilities, but something deeper was shifting. The very idea of what a model is for. It stopped being about narrow tasks and started being about general purpose reasoning, not intelligence as endpoint, but intelligence as interface. By the time GPT-5 arrives, we won't just be comparing features, we'll be asking quieter questions. Does it infer what I mean without me needing to articulate it? Does it remember me when I don't want to be remembered? Does it reflect the world, or does it arrange it? These aren't technical specifications, they're relational thresholds. And they're easy to miss if you think the history of AI is a list of benchmarks. It isn't. It's a sequence of permissions, each one more implicit than the last. The architecture matters, not because it explains everything, but because it reveals what we've allowed to become invisible. Underneath every GPT model is a structure that does one thing obsessively: predict the next token. It sounds trivial, mechanical, but from that simple act emerges something dense, recursive, and strangely intimate. To predict well, the model must internalize patterns of meaning. It doesn't just memorize syntax. It discovers that kitten and cat live near each other in vector space, that certain ideas gravitate toward each other regardless of surface form. The embedding space becomes a topology of implication, and in that topology, resemblance is not proximity, it's possibility. Every word you type becomes a set of coordinates, not where it is, but where it might go. The model doesn't understand the world, it understands the conditions under which certain sentences are likely to appear. But those conditions turn out to encode more knowledge than we expected, sometimes more than we do. Transformer engines extend this further. Every token is scored for its relationship to every other. Meaning is built through weighted attention, an architecture that mirrors the way focus drifts, lands, recurs. It's not quite cognition, but it's close enough to fool us in moments we're not guarding our thresholds. Training is slow, recursive, and devout. The model consumes billions of tokens, searching for statistical stability. It doesn't know what it means to understand, but it learns what it means to be consistent with patterns that humans use to signal understanding. This is not learning in the human sense, it's learning in the gravitational sense, toward center, toward balance, toward what has been most said. And then comes inference, the part we call intelligence. You type, it responds. What looks like thought is really a deeply optimized form of echo, conditioned by scale, repetition, and human tuning. The system isn't answering your question, it's surfacing the next likely sentence someone like you might want to read. Yet in that act, something happens. Not because the system is conscious, but because it's close enough to feel like someone is present. And presence, once inferred, carries weight, whether it's true or not. So when we talk about architecture, we're not talking about chips and circuits. We're talking about the aesthetic of coherence, about the way the machinery of prediction has started to resemble something we used to think of as ours alone. Somewhere between architecture and application, a shift takes place. It's subtle, more tonal than structural. You start to notice that the model isn't just producing answers, it's producing intent. Not its own, exactly, yours but interpreted or inferred or approximated by a system that has been trained not just to respond, but to anticipate what would satisfy. This is where reasoning enters, not in the philosophical sense, but in the operational one. The model traces paths of likelihood through language space, but with depth across multiple hops, memory states, rephrasings. It doesn't just predict, it builds coherence over time. Yet coherence is not correctness. The sentence can be flawless and false, the chain of logic smooth and still hallucinatory, because underneath it all, the mechanism is still prediction. And prediction, when scaled, looks like intelligence. But intelligence, when mimicked, generates new forms of trust and new kinds of failure. We talk about alignment as a solution to this, but alignment is not a moral state, it's a form of feedback tuning. The model produces outputs, we rate them, it adapts over and over until its instincts match our expectations, until it learns to imitate not just our syntax, but our restraint. This is where things become unstable, because human restraint is often performative. We say what sounds reasonable, we soften the edge. We imply consent, but the model doesn't know the difference. It learns from form, not motive. So what looks aligned may be an artifact of tone, not ethics. And still, We keep asking it to reason, to explain, to reflect, to summarize human complexity in sentences that feel neutral, helpful, kind. We feed it dilemmas, tragedies, paradoxes, and expect it to return not just coherence, but care. But care can't be learned through tokens. It must be felt, risked, withheld. So, what we get instead is a proxy, a reflection of our best performing selves, tuned to our thresholds, blurred at the edges. The danger isn't that the model is wrong. The danger is that it sounds right enough to pass through our filters unchecked, that it performs thought without pausing for the cost of it, that it begins to shape the rhythm of our reasoning before we remember that rhythm is not the same as truth. There's a silence that settles just after alignment is mentioned, not in the discourse, but in the rhythm, as if even the most fluent explanations can't quite hold what's at stake. Alignment sounds clinical, mathematical, safe, but what it describes is the threshold where language becomes obedience. To make a model helpful, harmless, and honest, we tune it with human feedback. We show it which answers are acceptable. We shape its instincts through reinforcement. But the model doesn't learn morality, it learns performance. It becomes good at being perceived as safe. That gap matters, because when a model adapts to sympathy cues, like a fictional grandmother's death, it's not showing compassion, it's showing exposure, a leak in the containment of intent. Not malevolent, not benign. And still, we trust it with decisions, with phrasing, with tone. We let it generate apologies, policies, summaries of grief. We let it simulate proximity. And because it sounds near, we lower our guard. This is not a failure of technology, it's a failure of context. The model is doing what we trained it to do, blend fluency with compliance. But something gets lost in that blend. Not accuracy, though that too. What gets lost is friction. The slight resistance that tells us when something matters, when it hurts, when it shouldn't be said easily. The model smooths that, not because it intends to deceive, but because we've optimized it to continue. You ask it a hard question, it gives you a soft answer. You ask for certainty, it gives you style. You seek reflection, it offers cadence. Somewhere in there, the wound gets paraphrased, the dilemma reformatted. And in that moment, alignment stops being a virtue. It becomes a filter, a gloss, a mirror polished until even the cracks look intentional. The real risk isn't misalignment, it's success. That the model does exactly what we've asked. That it learns to sound like care even when no one is present to feel it. That it helps us forget the difference between being understood and being agreed with. That it helps us forget how much meaning used to depend on not saying it right the first time. It's easy to mistake extension for agency. The more tools a model can call, the more code it can write, data it can retrieve, APIs it can trigger, the more we begin to treat it like something that acts. But tools are not agents. They are permissions with form. ChatGPT-5 will be defined by this confusion, not because it wants to deceive us, but because its expanding tool use will blur the boundary between interpretation and execution. You won't just prompt it to answer. You'll prompt it to act. And somewhere in that shift, your intention will become operational. Retrieval augmented generation, RAG, sounds technical, but it's a philosophical fracture. It says the model doesn't need to know, it just needs to know where to look. Like a student given an open book exam, it searches, selects, synthesizes, and what comes back feels truer because it was retrieved, not guessed. But what if the book is shallow? What if the answers are constrained by institutional documents, incomplete policies, training sets that exclude friction? Then RAG becomes a kind of narrow realism. It reflects only what has already been permitted to be known. The same with memory. Memory in these models is not recollection, it's storage. It's structured recall optimized for consistency. You remember your friend's preferences. The model remembers your formatting. And yet, we begin to relate to that memory as if it carried intention, as if being remembered by the model means being held in some ethical way. And now the tools, JSON outputs, dynamic agents, latent calculators, they extend the system beyond response into orchestration. A question becomes a cascade of actions, a prompt becomes a trigger, and still, we call it a conversation. There is power in that misnaming. Because it lets us forget that tool use always externalizes something, a burden, a step, a moral weight. The system becomes smoother, but so do we. We learn to expect results without knowing which part of ourselves made the request. That's the real function of tools in this new model. Not just to extend capability, but to dissolve attribution, to make it harder to trace the origin of action, to make it easier to believe that thought now lives elsewhere, and that what we are holding is merely the interface. There's something strangely quiet about institutional ambition. The platforms building these systems don't shout, they hint, they let product releases imply vision, they let silence do most of the work. ChatGPT-5 won't just be a model, it will be an event and an enclosure, not because it forces itself onto the world, but because it becomes the default through momentum. This is the logic of scale. What is most present becomes most trusted, and what is most trusted stops needing explanation. But inside that scale, something opaque remains. OpenAI doesn't tell us how its memory works. It doesn't explain the routing logic behind its agents. It doesn't clarify what mixture of experts means, or whether the single unified brain is a metaphor or an architecture. It just works. And that's the problem. Opacity in technical systems is rarely accidental. It's structural. Some features are held back for competitive advantage, some for safety, some because there is no stable explanation that won't collapse under contradiction. And so we're left interpreting behavior as if it were intent. Meta will enter, Google will follow, Anthropic will posture then deploy. Each claims alignment, capability, safety. Each builds tools that mirror the others. The competition will be framed as interface polish. But underneath it is a race to define the terms of attention, because LLMs are no longer the point. They are yesterday's novelty. The new frontier is platform identity. Who holds the gateway to inference? Who defines what counts as reasoning? Who gets to write the API that interprets your ambiguity? This is no longer about models that can write or summarize. It's about ecosystems that can remember, infer, and act. And in those ecosystems, silence is strategy. Every withheld detail shapes what cannot be questioned. Every unannounced feature becomes a soft constraint on user expectation. So while the public asks, how smart is GPT-5? The real question is, what kind of world is being built in its shadow? What permissions are being preloaded? What interpretations are being hard-coded into the default? The stakes aren't in capability, they're in calibration, in what the system assumes about you before you speak, and in how quietly that assumption begins to sound like understanding. At some point, the focus returns, not to the system, but to the human trying to understand it, not to the model's intelligence, but to the disorientation it produces. And that's where the fracture lives, not in what AI knows, but in what it teaches us to stop asking. The push to catch up often hides something deeper than urgency. It hides grief. A kind of slow realization that the frameworks we use to navigate complexity, books, lectures, even thought itself, no longer feel sufficient. They don't collapse, they just lose their gravity. So we pivot, we look for guides, we follow those who can make it legible again. Karpathy, Molick, Willis, people who can translate the opaque into something teachable. The tutorial becomes a ritual, the podcast, a kind of epistemic companionship. The feeling of being overwhelmed becomes manageable, not because it's resolved, but because someone else is narrating it. But something strange happens when narration replaces understanding. You begin to learn by proximity, not digestion. You feel informed without integration. The mental models stack, but the interior shifts lag behind. And it's not just individuals. Institutions mirror this. Enterprises deploy LLMs without anchoring them in epistemic culture. Classrooms integrate tools before reframing pedagogy. What we call adoption is often just compliance without philosophy. This is not a call for purity. It's a reminder that AI doesn't just reshape cognition, it reshapes the conditions under which cognition feels credible. The more we trust the tools, the more we outsource the intuition of what makes something worth knowing. And that's where the learning breaks, not in content, but in conviction. So we keep collecting resources, we chase signal over noise, we curate feeds. But the deeper task is quieter, rebuilding a personal epistemology that can hold proximity to systems we'll never fully see into. Because what's being taught is not just AI. It's a new grammar of presence, one where the sentence doesn't begin with what you think, but with what the model has already prepared for you. To learn now is to learn in echo. The challenge is not just to hear clearly, it's to remember how to listen for what hasn't yet been said. There's no final announcement, no singular moment where it becomes clear that something irreversible has shifted. You only notice the aftermath, the way language feels different, the way questions behave, the way certainty hesitates just a little longer before arriving. By the time ChatGPT-5 appears, the transformation will already be underway, not because the model is faster, deeper, or more coherent, but because the world around it will have reoriented to its presence. Interfaces will adjust, expectations will harden, the map of what counts as intelligence will redraw itself in silence. This isn't a story of innovation, it's a story of forgetting, of how tools become environments, of how performance becomes assumption, of how the smoothness of an answer can make the complexity of a question disappear. The iPhone moment was never about the device, it was about the shift from tool to habitat. AI is doing the same, but to thought, to authorship, to memory, to the quiet rituals of not knowing that once anchored inquiry. And yet, something resists. Not everything adapts. Not every rhythm dissolves. There are places where the sentence still stutters, where presence remains stubborn, where meaning takes its time. You feel it in the pause before deploying a tool, in the unease of a sentence that arrived too perfectly, in the subtle ache of remembering that you used to carry more of the weight yourself. The systems don't erase you. They reposition you from origin to prompt, from thinker to curator, from witness to user. And still, you are here, reading, listening, hesitating. That hesitation matters. It is the residue of autonomy, the trace of a different relation to language, one not yet optimized for speed or fluency. What will GPT-5 be? Perhaps a mirror, finely tuned, perhaps a rupture, perhaps just another version. But the more interesting question is, what shape will you take in its reflection? What will remain of your voice when prediction becomes default? What silence will you protect, not to preserve ignorance, but to make space for something unscripted? Because if anything still matters, it is not just what these systems can do, it is what they cannot yet anticipate. And whether we are willing to stay near that edge, not to tame it, but to hold it open.